Oh, hello and welcome everyone to this session of the Salon of Classical Architecture. Today we're going to talk about quite a relevant book for traditional architecture and for the fight against modernism, which is Modernismus by Reginald Blomfield, and then we will have our usual question time and the project critique for those who want to bring it. So as you know, this is the third session of this autumn season. We have been talking about architectural education in Spain from 1742 to 1956. We have been talking about the precursors of modern tradition, so that last generation of classicists, of which Blomfield is part. We're going to enter a little bit more into his works. And then on the next session, we will see those architects who live with the modernists. We're going to introduce them today so that you understand a little bit about all this generation who started to live with the modernists. We will have a special guest, Alexander Keys, who's going to talk about architecture and symbolism, a very, very interesting topic he's going to introduce. Then we will have a third one about surviving modernism, which is all the architects who continued practicing traditional architecture during the 50s and 60s. As you know, we are putting our stop in 1972, which is the symbolic origin of postmodernism, as Charles Jenks puts this as the year when Plot ego was demolished and symbolizing the beginning of all the disappointment with modernism, if you want to say so. And then, last but not least, just before Christmas, we're going to talk about masters of restoration. We're going to talk about architects who worked during 20th century and who did master restoration work for, especially for the topic that is more interesting to us in terms of the preservation of traditional architecture, and how, on one side, all the school by Viollet Dick was superseded, but the epic of the Ruskin school of let things decay, etc., isn't as such, and also more important and more relevant for us, how the what the Chart of Faith says and what it doesn't say, and what the problem is, the regulation or the interpretation. But we will see that it's almost in a month's time. So let's start with Modernismus by Reginald Blomfield. So last session, we talked a little bit about Blomfield, and I cannot stress more the importance of Blomfield in that sense. I think it has been an architect that has been forgotten, and it has been ridiculed, not only forgotten, but ridiculed. If you look information about him, it was intransigent. They portrayed him as a grumpy grandpa who didn't want to progress, which was quite close to that, to quite opposed to anything. And well, we have to admit that he was very eloquent, he had a sharp tongue. At the same time, he was very much aware of his own limitations. He was very much aware of the time he was living in, and he was very much aware of the risks of the new times that were to come after him. And that's very important to know because Blomfield was probably the first and last architect who battled against modernism, who opposed his pen against modernism. Others would keep writing, but they would accept that they were losing the battle. Um, a modernist gave them the magnanimity of the winner, and those were allowed to survive history, if you want to say so. That was the case of Lutyens. We will see another one in Spain, Luis Moya, who had a very sad case. We will see as well the burning of the Viñolas in Santiago de Cuba and Santiago de Chile, and many other things of the things that happened when modernism finally took over. I mean, and you can consider in that regard, in that epic, that, for example, Council Vatican II was the maximum triumph of modernism in terms of ecclesiastical architecture. So those was what we will be calling surviving in the triumphant years of modernism, which will be the third part of this series. So this is our gentleman. Doesn't look like such a grumpy grandpa. Actually, looks like a sort of fun photograph that they took him, and you can see that he has vivid eyes and a sort of a smile, and he was a nice person. He did a lot. He had a very successful firm. He managed and he moved from several positions until reaching his final successful years. And what it is very important about Blomfield is that we are normally told, oh, these people didn't know how to integrate technology. These people didn't know how to electricity, etc. Blomfield lived all this time. And Blomfield designed for the telephone. Blomfield designed for the car, even if he didn't like them, because he's very verbal about him not liking cars. But he designs for the cars. He knows that they need to be there. He designs bathrooms. He designs taking electricity in mind. He designs a lot of things taken into consideration. He knew what the radio was. He knew what the television was, even it was just in tatters back then, because television was invented in the 1920s, precisely in Britain. So what we can see with him and his generation, you see, he was born in 1856. He was born in 1940. He died in 1942. He was that is those people built in born, sorry, in middle 19th century were those ones who practically lived all their lives in the tradition, and only at the end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century, they saw all the progress coming. But this, you cannot see this as a disruptive thing, because things were step by step entering. And what you need to remember when we were talking about last week about the Belle Epoque, it was there was a faith in progress. So for all these architects, there was the faith of a new era coming, but that didn't mean that they had to reject everything before. For them, there was a continuation in history, a continuation in tradition. They didn't see any rupture. The rupture actually came with the war. With the First World War was the real breaking point of this. But before we enter into that, let's talk a little bit about his biography. Blomfield didn't come from sort of nowhere background. He came from a very literate background. He was related to the Church of England, so he ensured the being the son of a reverend and the son and the grandson of the Bishop of London, who was himself a great classicist in the sense of studies of the classics. Blomfield grew in an environment where there was it was a literate environment, and an environment where there was an interest in the classics. And this is very important because obviously that shape, even if he barely met his grandfather, probably he never met him because his father was elsewhere. The parish was very far, and his grandfather was still living in London when he died. Probably he never met him, but obviously his influence on the classics was there, and probably it was distributed to his father. Just a little note about the portrait of his father. I mean, it's sort of imitating a similar portrait by Christopher Rank, while he's shown with the background of St. Paul's cupola at the background of the painting. And also quite important is you may see as well that a lot of these portraits. This is not particularly important for Bishop Blomfield, but you see that all of them they usually are at the base of a column. You always see the base of a column or the base of a pilaster in them, and that's not deliberate. That's a sort of humbling way of putting anyone's down, in the sense of saying you need to remember this is a portrait, which is obviously the maximum level of egocentrism that any person could have back then in life, which is what you could say a show of selfie nowadays. But with the difference is that they were shown as little because they were shown as part of a much bigger architectural environment. And that's very important to consider, because all these environments, all these backgrounds were usually classical architecture. And that's very important to see the power of classical architecture in the portrait, which obviously is a interesting topic to discuss, but obviously we are not going to discuss here. But I just wanted you to make aware, and next time you see a portrait of an architect, of a king, of whoever, you will realize that very rarely you see the full column. And those in which you see the full column is usually religious painting, because obviously we're portraying God, we're portraying Virgin Mary, and then they are big enough to be shown with the full architecture. Human beings aren't. So that's important to consider. Well, I know that probably I have made 10,000 mistakes against the Catholicism, but okay, apologies to the Catholics for that. He not only his father and his grandfather were very literate people, his uncle was Arthur Blomfield, quite a famous architect back then. So he didn't like much working for his uncle, and you will see a little bit now. Arthur Blomfield, obviously, you can see the years where he was working. He was very active in the central years of 19th century, which meant that the architecture that he was doing was Gothic. And this is the sort of architecture, this is late architecture that Royal College of Music from the 1870s when Blomfield was a young man. And here, I mean, it's very medieval architecture. It's departing from the triumphant neo-Gothic of the central years of 19th century. We're going to see a couple of examples now. Arthur Blomfield did a lot of churches. Reginald Blomfield didn't do many churches, although he was a religious person. But what it is true is that those architects during 19th century were specialized in neo-Gothic, ended up designing lots of churches in a moment in which everyone wanted to have everything Gothic. And the problem is that everyone ended up looking like a church, and people ended up getting a bit bored quickly. So by the 1870s, 1880s, this was too much, and probably the John Blomfield was living on his own avant-garde, on his own modern ways, which was what later on, we will see a little bit now, would be called the Queen Anne style. So this is very important because we're going to see him later references to all this strictness and all this toughness of the Victorians towards the Neo-Gothic, because in the central years of 19th century, Neo-Gothic was the strict way to go. It was morally right. And it was the new architecture for England, the new architecture for the British Empire. Not only England, it was Britain and the British Empire when we were talking here. Then later on, things would evolve, but for 20 years, for almost 30 years, from the 1840s to the 1870s or even the 1880s, Gothic was the one who was winning. And you remember we were talking about the Great Exhibition of 1851 in the previous session, and that was also one of the reasons. In Britain wanted to show off the industrial power in that exhibition because it was the most industrialized nation in the world back then. But there was a sense of disappointment when they saw that the products that they were offering as the beautiful things of the industrial revolution were not as good as other products done by hand. So, and that's what ended up then everyone taking a look at neo-Gothic to ensure that sort of of balance. And then for 50 years, then together with that was all the interest in restoration and also the ways of represent the power of Britain as opposed to how other countries were representing, especially France, which France, where Francisco is there. You're seeing a lot of Haussmannian and Second Empire architecture. That means that Britain, who wanted to pose to France and to show something different, they wanted to show that they were rooted in the past as opposed to the French architecture, which despite that indirect links with Baroque and neoclassical architecture, it was representing as the future, as something completely new. And that's something that you need to understand. The Opera de Garnier, the Haussmannian Paris, all this architecture wasn't perceived as a connection to the past. It was a gate to the future. I know that some of you, sometimes when we discuss in the group, say, oh, Paris is boring, the architecture is very boring, it's all the same, blah, blah, blah. Fine. But this architecture was conceived as something modern and moving forward. Why? Because the Second French Empire was something new, and the renovation of Paris was something new. So, but again, there was an universal value in classical architecture that is what takes them there. As opposed to that, UK will try to find its way through Neo-Gothic. And talking about Neo-Gothic, we have to talk about this gentleman. So this is a caricature of George Edmund Street. I think we have talked about him other times. George Edmund Street was I would say it was the most Gothic architect you could imagine, more Gothic than the Gothic themselves. And he was, I see some comments here. Okay, great. Thank you for sharing the pictures. I think that everyone is going to enjoy the views. I mean, they are amazing. So please keep sharing because they are really cool, and also you get the chance of seeing a part of the opera that you don't normally see, which is the back. So that's very very interesting, and thank you for sharing the picture. So everyone, take a look at the chat to take a look at the picture that Francisco is sharing, and thank you very much for doing that. So the architect that you see here is George Edmund Street, as I was saying, and he was one expert in Gothic. And you can see there was a caricature from, I think it was from Punch, one of the satirical magazines of the Victorian times, one of the most famous one. And here he's showing his winner proposal for the Royal Court of Justice in London, which are these ones we're going to see. I think that we saw them previously. We saw them when we were talking about neo-Gothic, and probably one day we will, one of the seasons, we will do one about neo-Gothic and Gothic revivals, because I think it's necessary to talk about all the different approaches. And as you can see here, this is a medieval fantasy. So people, one of the things that the modernists would criticize, they were thinking that they were rebuilding the Middle Ages, that it's a Disney fantasy, etc. Modernists like hate is gonna hate, as we say nowadays. But the truth is that this building was linking, well, the whole purpose of building it Gothic. Remember that when we were talking about Pugin's contrast, the whole purpose of doing of building in a Gothic style was to link the modern Britain with the fundamentals of the British past, English in this case. Why? Because, as you know, while most of the countries in the world have a constitution, Britain doesn't have a constitution. It's the oldest parliamentary monarchy in the world, but doesn't have a constitution. Never had a constitution. All the constitution is based on custom. That meaning is that everything is based on a precedent. Everything is based on what has been said before, and everything is based. The closest into a constitution that they have is the Carta Magna, done in 13th century. So there was a link, and it was usually perceived that the balance achieved in the Middle Ages was better than what happened later when the monarchies became more authoritarian and they became more absolutist, and then after the Restoration, there were a lot of problems in the terms of the House of Commons, how the commoners were elected, and also the House of Lords was getting increased, and went from let's say that a selective representation of the highest noblemen and highest properties of the church to just a way of giving favors to the noblemen, especially since it's Georgians. Why am I saying all this? Because the problem with the commoners that were elected more or less in a pseudo-democratic way, the problem is that a lot of these commoners were not selected anymore among the rightful people from the villages, but there was a lot of corruption. There was a lot of noblemen who were entering into the House of Commons, and there was something that were called the rotten boroughs, which were like cities that in the Middle Ages had certain levels of power, but had lost it, but still had the right of sending people to the parliament. Two people, which can be a big balance in a vote. So that meant that a lot of noblemen controlled those pocket boroughs as opposed to what happened in the Middle Ages. So what is this representing? What was the neo-Gothic and the Gothic revival representing in Britain? It was not only a nostalgic thing to the past, it was a way of defending the rights and the rightful ways to do the parliamentary monarchy. Because by doing that, you were not talking anymore. If you were doing neoclassical, people would still think of the rotten boroughs, on the increase of the House of Lords by the Georgians. But when they saw that, they saw like the pure Middle Ages, like the Carta Magna and all the other documents that are the fundamentals of the British rule and the British monarchy. So that's what you need to see when these people were doing everything. And George Edmund Street at the same time was quite a character. He wrote a monumental 2-volume history of Gothic architecture in Spain, and he is very verbal in saying that he didn't like anything he saw. So it's very interesting. He took so much effort in writing a book of 2 volumes of criticizing. He wrote another one about Italy, of course, criticizing it because of the lack of Gothic. The one in Spain was because obviously lack of Gothic and too French. And he wrote another one on France, and of course, it was too French for him. So the perfect one was the British Gothic. So in this environment, George Edmund Street was slightly older than Arthur Blomfield, but that's the environment in which Arthur Blomfield thrived. Arthur Blomfield was doing a lot of churches, and Blomfield didn't like that, basically. He studied also at Exeter College in Oxford. He took a first-class degree in classic because Blomfield was a great classicist in the sense of he knew the Greeks, he knew the Romans, he could speak Greek, he could speak Latin. But he also, I mean, in all this British system in which you learn everything and nothing at the same time, he attended a lot of John Ruskin lectures, but he found the atmosphere of rapid oration, which with Ruskin and all he said was received by the young ladies was too much for him. So, and this is something that is interesting because it's putting us the perspective of a young man, because it was Blomfield in his 20s, not liking what Ruskin was saying. And this is interesting as well. That's what I'm bringing this caricature of Ruskin. We're going to talk a bit in the next slide, because Ruskin is perceived as the great precursor of modernism, the great bringer of everything that should be good. But he was perceived right as a snob back then. And this caricature I am bringing is a moment in which it reflects Sheffield, the city of Sheffield, which is one of the most industrialized cities in the Victorian era, was quite ugly, full of smoke, unhealthy cities. All the when you imagine the novels of Charles Dickens and all the infrahuman conditions in the factories, Oliver Twist, and things like that. That's what you're reporting. Sheffield. It was even worse than London, which is a lot to say in Victorian times. So if in a harsh time you were told that you are harsh, imagine. So the people from Sheffield invited Ruskin to go to Sheffield to give a lecture to see how to improve the quality of Sheffield. And Ruskin refused. And that's why they did this caricature of him. I mean, I think you cannot see very well, but he has the halo of superfine art. And also he in the collar, he said is signed Rusty. So instead of Ruskin, Rusty. So he's making a joke with that. And then, I mean, what they put here is the answer to him because he was invited, he refused to go, and then they published the caricature. And then he defended himself for not going and sent this. I lost a frightful quantity of time because people won't read what I ask them to read, nor believe anything of what I tell them, and yet ask me to talk whenever they think they can make a shilling or two at the door by me. I have written 50 times, if once, that you can't have art where you have a smoke. You might have it in hell, perhaps, for the devil is too clever not to consume his own smoke if he wants to. But you will never have it in Sheffield. You may learn something about nature, shivered, stones, and iron, and what little you can see of that sort. I am going to try and show you, but pictures, never. So this is a very harsh statement. But at the same time, Ruskin himself is saying something very interesting, and that I would want you to take as an advice when you read about all what generated modernism. People won't read what I ask them to read, nor believe anything of what I tell them. This is very important because when you read all these people, you discover something completely different. And this is going to be the case that we're going, and I would love you to discover by reading Blomfield that whatever you have read about him on the internet, which is pretty harsh, is not true. And there is a lot of hope a love in his book that when you read otherwise, it's like it is portrayed as an old man mocking art, and it's not. And while it is part of the case, he's pretty much aware of his lack of knowledge of modern art, but all the parts of architecture, it's written with eloquence and very good taste. We will see that later. So this is the environment in which Ruskin was also living. So let's not keep him as well as the god of simplicity, etc. He was also snobbish. We didn't want to go to Sheffield because it was too dirty for him. So these things have to be also kept in mind, and also a way of understanding a little bit how the Victorians faced humor. But take the idea of this environment, no Ruskin wanting to have radical beauty and refusing to talk to the workers because it was too much for him, and like Sheffield was worse than the hell, etc. Compared to what we hear now, that Ruskin was the savior of art and nature. Yeah, I mean, if you only want to be in the middle of pretty art and nature, you can be that. But which is also what they're portraying him at the base, you see, with all the flowers, as opposed with the background of Sheffield. Coming back to Blomfield's biography, sorry. In 1884, he founded the Arts Worker Guild in London, which is still alive and thriving, with many members that are like a representative of the arts and crafts in United Kingdom. And initially, the Art Worker Guild was an institution to promote the labor of the arts. The and with all this 19th century utopian socialism idea that you are producing art, but you are also a worker, and that you are enlightened by the work you do. It was mixing all the medieval ideas with modern ideas. There was also debate against the architectural education, in which what the architect should be, what the technicals, what the professionals, what the artists, what the craftsmen, what were they? And as part of these debates, initially Blomfield was positioned more on the more, let's say, establishment position, in which the architect is a professional, is superior to the rest, etc. All the architects that are here and all the architects who are listening on the video know very well that that's how we are all trained. No? We are special people. But later on, Blomfield would say something which I find is very beautiful. I think it is due to these young men of the 80s, himself included, because he was very young in the 80s, that the arts were rescued from the paralyzing conventions of the Victorian era. This is important. He's making a difference. He's detaching himself from all the Victorian values, from all this Ruskin, all the neo-Gothic, all the art and craft. It was perceived by the young men on those years of the 1880s, people who were in their mid-20s, as paralyzing conventions. And then for them, because it was the moment we will saw a little bit now, it was the moment there was a transition from all that rigid neo-Gothic, all this moralistic neo-Gothic, the moralistic art and craft. There was a transition towards what was perceived as more liberating classicism. And this is important. Liberating classicism to be rescued from the convention of the Victorian era. When you think about even Luthians and etc., people will associate it with Victorian architecture. These people were not Victorians at all. They were bored and tired of what they were perceiving as I said, paralyzing, like yeah, paralyzing convention that wouldn't let you breathe. It was like totally structured, totally sclerotic in some sense. There was no way that you could leave that, and we could explore the reasons. There were because you have to also to understand that when Queen Victoria comes to the throne, the dynasties, the monarchy in Britain wasn't at the best time. There was a slight republicanism as well, which obviously today would be impossible to think about. And even Queen Victoria had a terror attack, an attempt of assassination And all that was perceived because the monarchy was perceived as vicious, was perceived as no moral, was perceived like a sort of perverts, because that's what King George IV was, and William IV was a bit of that as well. So then Queen Victoria had to fight that, and the way she fought that was by becoming the image of the strict image that we have now. It's like, even it is always said Queen Victoria never smiled, and there is a picture of her smiling, and it's like the oldest thing that you can think, no, because Queen Victoria smiled, she never smiled, blah blah blah. So all these were the conventions that were settling the architecture, and of course we were having, as we said, as we saw, the architecture of George Edmund Street, the architecture of Arthur Blomfield, all that was a rigid medievalistic architecture that was not, that was at some point talking you about the freedoms of the Middle Ages, but at the same time it was putting you onto the structural strict social conventions of the new middle class that was emerging, that didn't want to be identified with the vices of the monarchy. So you need to understand that is what the paralyzing conventions mean. And that's something that you see as well a lot, and you can find even parallels with fashion, in the sense that since 19th century, you see, for example, male fashion before the 1830s, and there was much more color, much more fun. And from the 1830s onward, male fashion becomes like brown, black, and blue. Forget about it. Maybe in summer you can have some beige. And that is because of that strictness and that toughness in the morals that are inserted as a way of moving forward in 19th century. The same year of 1884, Blomfield also opens his own practice in 17 Southampton Street in London, very close to Covent Garden. The building doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately, but that's where he had his firm. Ironically enough, there were other architects in that building which were having his firm, and all of them had something in common. They had been former pupils of Richard Norman Shaw. Richard Norman Shaw was older than Blomfield, of course, but was younger than Street. So he was in between. He was also slightly younger than Blomfield's uncle. So he started in the neo-Gothic tradition, but he knew that he had to go over that it was reaching its own limits to a certain extent, because it's what we were saying before. If you will go back to this image of the royal courts of justice, if you keep on this direction, your house looks like a church. And I forgot to bring the images, but the George Edmund Street house is still standing. And if you look at its interiors, they look like a church. The fireplaces look like altar pieces. The ceilings look like a church ceiling, because it was a firm believer that was the way of doing things and was the moral way of linking. But Shaw had a different point of view, and in the sense that he lived the limitation. George Edmund Street was too old by the time that Neo Gothic was exhausted, but Richard Norman Shaw has to leave a new era. And together with the art and craft, he moved towards something new. This is one of his first projects, his first big country house, Craigside in Northumberland. It's still a bit of art and craft, meets neo-Gothic, meets Tudor, but there is a mix of everything. And that is because, as I was saying before, by the end of the neo-Gothic stage of the Victorian architecture, there was the feeling that, yeah, everyone was believing in neo-Gothic, but neo-Gothic was too much, and you couldn't get what you wanted. So maybe it was time to things, get what it worked from what it worked. And because the art and craft was also trying to merge the Middle Ages crafts with the modern industry, it was the perfect moment for Shaw to start thinking and experimenting. So this is how the house looks nowadays. It's a very wonderful stone house with ample windows, and this will be something that it will be appreciated back then, because the big windows when you are in southern latitudes, you don't need much openings because the light enters anyway. But when you don't have much light, you appreciate big openings. And that was a problem with neoclassical architecture, was a problem also with neo-Gothic, where you wanted to have the chunkiness of Gothic because just to emulate that. With this architecture, which it didn't have a name then, but it will get a name very soon, you start getting the possibility of doing much wider openings as they did back then. And that came to a new idea of how to do architecture, in the sense that it allowed the architects to mix different styles. I know that the term that later on appeared was eclecticism, and we have discussed several times that the eclecticism appears as a negative connotation, even if it is not negative itself, but appears as wishy-washy, in the sense that you just get everything you want. Like if a young toddler opens the wardrobe and puts all the parents' clothes at the same time, the shoes, the hat, the father's jacket, and the mom's dress, everything at the same time. Doesn't matter, because they are having fun. So that's the image that they have about eclecticism. But these people were very serious about it. We talked last time, and I don't want to enter much into it, because otherwise we start talking hours. Wanted to show the interior. Quite a majestic interior. And everything you see there is a sense of modernity everywhere. First of all, I mean, the lighting obviously is new, but you have a fireplace, massive fireplace, which has been designed. You can see the you can see a sofa here. There is another one that you cannot see, but there is a sofa on the other side, to ensure that the room is massively big. But if you were alone in that house, you could also go to that nook and stay comfortable and cozy, while you are still having the rest of the room for entertainment or anything. And also the ley lights. It's a vaulted ceiling that it's showing you a lot of light coming. That was a symbol of progress, because obviously in order to do that, you needed to do cast iron structure. This couldn't happen in a medieval hall. So this is the progress that show was bringing. Well, for the Gothic revivalist, it would still be like an uncomfortable thing to deal with, technology. It was like, yeah, this is the problem, because yeah, but they were to a certain point they were a bit Luddite, while Norman Shaw would accept technology, would embrace it to keep designing. And again, I mean, for this reason, Norman Shaw is presented as a precursor of modernism. Well, he actually wasn't. He was just a continuator of tradition and getting from the past what was going to ensure the transmission of the good things for the future. On a more urban side, Shaw is the author of a lot of buildings around Kensington and Chelsea, what it is called Hanstown, because they were the former lands of a guy called Hans, and Hans Holland, I think it was, who was also an architect, but also parts of other, the Cadogan Estate, Harrods Estate, etc. But he built a lot there. And he built in what would be later called Pont Street Dutch, and later on also be called Queen Anne style. So why this? Because for the people in the 1870s, 1880s, at the same way that they were introducing elements from Tudor architecture in the country houses that would help to solve the issues with neo-Gothic, because at the same time, when you were into religious architecture, you could have a direct reference, and it was proper Gothic revival. But when you were still in domestic houses, you could never depart from the Gothic with CK, because you needed that sort of fanciness and creativity in order to do things that you couldn't find in a church. So because of that fanciness, they start looking at other ways of exploring, because what we saw before in Craigside could work well for the countryside, but it might not work very well for an urban environment where, excuse me, what you wanted to show was still classical architecture. And they came up with the so-called Pont Street Dutch style that takes its name because it was all the buildings were done at the same time, more or less, by Norman Shaw and people close to him, developers close to him, in Pont Street in London. And Dutch is because there is a very obvious Dutch influence in the gables and other treatments. And this is because they wanted to emulate the reigns of William III and Mary II, William Mary, and Queen Anne, which were the last of the Stuarts in the crown. So for them, it was like a special period because it was the transition between the Elizabethan and Jacobean architecture of the early 17th century to the later early 18th century Georgian architecture. And this architecture was also perceived as more freestyle. So you didn't have to abide the convention of the full convention of classical. You didn't have to abide with the full convention of Gothic, but you could have the best of both. And for example, one very direct thing that you see compared to Craig's side is that we still have those mullion windows coming from the Tudor times, but then we're adding classical elements. We're adding a classical pediment, we're adding a classical entablature to them, and we are mixing the concept of the Tudor and Jacobean window with the classical window. The Georgians wouldn't have had that. The Georgians would have had more like what you see here on the left, like a massive big opening. They wouldn't have the mullion, but that would create a structural problem because you could only get certain span where you're doing load bearing. And this is what the modernists would end up calling eclecticism. And even the people from the time, especially as you know, we were talking that they wanted to have everything classified and perfectly noted. And then when they were seeing a building like this, they were saying, okay, is this building classical? Is this building Italian because it had balusters? Is this building Tudor because it had mullion windows? Or is it Dutch because it has Dutch gables? So they were confused on that. And in order to define that, they came with a term that then would be used later on by the modernists as a bad term because even at the beginning it was pejorative because this was like an hybrid. This was like a dog without pedigree, and it was not acceptable for a proper architect to do that, especially because it was coming from the Gothic architects who had been pure Gothic and an even older generations of late Georgian that have been fully classicist and fully Greek revival. Norman Shaw would take this so-called style. You cannot call it a style as per se because I mean again in the 19th century a strict division of styles. The style need to be easily identifiable. No, Gothic has pointed arches, Baroque has quirky shapes, blah blah blah. But these had everything at the same time. So that's why they came with the Queen Anne style. This is number one, St. James Street, one of his finest works, very late works. It's almost his last work. And I'm bringing it so that you can see that the perfect matching between the render and the final construction, and as a way to reflecting on how much nowadays there is a severe difference between what you see in the renders and what it is finally built, which is a shame, but it is what it is. So on that sense, you can see again it's a mix of classical and Dutch elements, but to a point in which they are not Dutch anymore. They are like genuinely British because they have been evolving and evolving and evolving for the past 40 years. And also it was implementing a new material or a industrialized material, who was the brick. And you can see all these brick panels that were actually mass produced to be there. I mean, these were some more special buildings, but the one in Pont Street, when you go there, when you walk around Pont Street, you see that the elements are repeated, 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 because it was a sort of, I remember I call it once industrialized beauty. Everything was mass produced, and because it was mass produced, it was cheap to have. And to close up with Norman Shaw Arc, this is his last work. This is the Piccadilly Hotel, still standing. Not in full. All this right part was never built. There is another otherwise lovely building to the right, but the whole thing was built with this amazing courtyard at the third level that nowadays covered with a conservatory. and quite an interesting building. It has several levels of basements with ballrooms and a pool. It's super cool building. I mean, because it's very interesting. And all that was done at the beginning of 20th century. So again, we're talking about a pool, about a gym, about technology that can be integrated within classical architecture, but then we have been told otherwise. So this is the building nowadays. So it's executed as designed. You can see here that they did this conservatory, and the building just goes to the other side. This is Piccadilly Circus, and to the other side you have Regent Street, which he also started to design. And then it was precisely Reginald Blomfield who would take over the the designs when Norman Shaw was too old to continue, and all his colleagues were busy with other stuff. And this is how it currently looks. I mean, all of you who are coming to London for the Inbound Congress, I'm sure that you will have a chance to walk through Regent Street. It's a wonderful street to understand Edwardian architecture and to see the possibilities of classicism, because all these buildings were done from the early 1900s to the 1920s, 1930s, and all of them still work perfectly today. They are still suitable for retail, suitable for offices. They respond very well to the needs of a modern society. And the whole street was designed for traffic, etc. So it's completely different. Nowadays they want to pedestrianize it. Hopefully it will happen soon. And just to close, this is the best book. You know that I love recommending books. This is the best book about Richard Norman Shaw. If you're interested about him, uh, try to find this book secondhand. It should be easy. There are some books by himself available online, but they are sketches and they are from when he was younger. So still when he was on the Gothic revival stage. So they're very interesting because he was, as everyone back then, he was an excellent drafter, but it doesn't reflect the greatness of his whole career. It reflects just the interesting his interesting beginnings. So coming up with Blomfield's bill, between 1890 and 1892, he established a furniture company called Kenton and Co. He didn't do this alone. He did it with many other Blomfield pupils, Norman Shaw pupils, and they did it with a very commercial reason. Instead of commissioning furniture to other craftsmen or to other furniture makers, they would do like a sort of syndicate, or they would have like a common company, a holding, and when their clients ask them to furnish the houses instead of going elsewhere, they would go to Kenton and buy the furniture that they had designed. The company was very successful, even if it lasted only 2 years, and basically died of success. No, it was so successful that, and the architects themselves were also so successful of that little circle that they couldn't have two companies, their own company plus Kenton, so they ended up closing it. But they produced a lot in those 2 years. And again, I mean, if you only think about Blomfield for the criticism that you read about him online, you could imagine that he was designing heavy Victorian furniture full of carvings, etc. This is what he was designing. So the designs were already very sleek. Some would call it modern, but they were the spirit of the time. So, and I wanted to show this to you before moving forwards on Blomfield's career, because this is the furniture on which he was living. This is the furniture that he was putting for his clients. So don't, whether you like it or not, I think that it's very nice. It's very good quality furniture, very nicely designed, with a lot of craft on them, because doing all these marquetry roses is very expensive. And also it's telling you that this is not high luxury furniture, which is also very important to consider, because when we go to museums now, we see all the finest example of furniture from the past, which is the example that have lasted, and they have lasted because they were of extreme quality for the super wealthy. Normal people had much more normal furniture, which hasn't survived. Sometimes because the quality wasn't good, but other times just because the wear and tear I mean, if you're having a chair like that one, no matter how beautiful it is, if you're using every single day of your life, eventually the chair weathers and you need to throw it away. So that's why some things that the day-to-day things are not so present, but they're interesting to know. So just what I wanted you to take a glimpse of what he was doing back then. It wasn't the super Art Nouveau because that was still a very niche thing for only for very very creative people, but there was something in between. And as I was saying, continuing with Norman Shaw architecture, he continued doing all the quadrant in Piccadilly, which is all the beginning of the Piccadilly Circus itself, and the first batch of Regent Street. He basically continued Norman Shaw's architecture, but as you can see, I mean, he used a classical language. But if we compare that with what Shaw did here, with all these wonderful Escamozzi columns and all that, he went a bit more constrained on the architectural approach, which is also something to consider when you talk about the Edwardian Baroque. People think about big expression. We were seeing Buckingham Palace last week, and it's very constrained. It's very neoclassical, very very puristic architecture. They had with advantage that they had 2,000 years of creativity to choose what to do and what not to do. So they did very little, but the little they did was very good in terms of ornating and going over the top. And you can even see, if we go back to show project, even if you consider this, what is here the big thing? Isn't the two gables? The rest of the building is very, very simple in itself, as you can see still nowadays. Blomfield also did country houses. So this is something that he was versatile. I mean, and he did quite a lot of country houses. And I am bringing specifically this one because to me has a meaning. I was about to work in this house, never did, but this is Brooklands house in Weybridge. This is part of a college. That's what I'm showing you. So there is no NDA. So we were appointed to take a review and we would convert this. This is now mix of classes and offices, and we would convert this into a more upgrade accommodation. So less classes and offices, more like a nice library, the restaurant, communal spaces for the students, so that they could enjoy the beautiful house, because the house is practically intact on the inside, very weathered but practically intact. And on the other side, it has a unfortunately very very badly maintained gardens, but we wanted to reinstate them. And I mean, the house, as you can see, I mean, it's in very good condition because it has been in constant use. Even it needs a bit of a refurbishment. And we did, as part of this, the house is here at my previous company, Stanhope Gate. We designed a master plan for the area. You can see some modernist buildings here, which were the original buildings that they couldn't be demolished, and then there was an extension of buildings to residential buildings to generate more profit for the college. And you can see that we have 3 levels of density. We had a very low density here. I mean, I'm bringing it a bit of to show a little bit some things that I have designed. We have a first layer of low level density of villas and detached houses. We have a level of maximum density, which is not maximum at all, is 3 4 story buildings, emulating a little bit like houses in central London or in any central British town, and then a slightly lower level of density, but equally good design buildings, which were supposed to be social housing. So this is important because normally social housing tends to get like the brutalist building, and here we wanted to also to give the people who had to be who could live in social housing, also give them part of the experience of living in a nice beautiful environment, because sometimes it is perceived that because it's social housing it has to be just concrete blocks and glass with prefabricated panels, and doesn't have to be the case. And to close up a little bit Blomfield's architectural biography. This is this is a gate he designed in France as a memorial after the war. So it's a very, very beautiful, and you can read there to the armies of the British Empire who stood here from 1914 to 1918, and to those of their dead who have no known grave. So it's a monument to the unknown soldier because there were a lot in the First World War. And then with the two mottos, pro patria, pro lege. So meaning for the country and for the law. It's a sort of gift of the British Empire to to Belgium as a sort of acknowledgement of all the things that the Belgium had to grow through. But we were talking the other day as well in the group about the gates. I think that this is a wonderful example of how to design a monumental gate. It's part of the walls. You can see the walls in the side, brick. Obviously, we're in Belgium. There's a lot of brick, but it's a beautiful neoclassical door from the 1920s. So again, I mean, it's like when they are telling you, oh no, everyone was modernist, but then look, this is what they were doing, what they were commissioning to the actual architects back then. So this is very important for you to see this. And internally, it's also wonderful. And I know that maybe some of you might say, oh, this is a strict classicism. And maybe it is, but I think that I personally don't like much the term because it is normally used by the modernist, either A, by the modernist to say that it was a stage of stripping out elements. So they were taking out things, and for the postmodern to justify, no, because they were taking out things, I'm taking out them as well, no, with the difference that these people were doing it for a reason. We're going to specify to discuss them now. What the postmodernists were doing just to annoy everyone else. So what were the reasons why these people were like opting for this more simplified classicism? And you need to understand that his whole history of classicism has gone from a very, very ornate and creative and, let's say, non-Vitruvian approach to classicism, which is basically the Baroque approaches, the Mannerist approach, and a more strict classicism, which was more the beginning of the Quinquecento, neoclassicism, Regency, and it has been going in between both. Both of them are same, are the same sides, or the two sides of the same coin, if you want to say so. It's different ways of expressing, different ways of using the language. And after the Second World War, after all the years of extreme lavishness of Art Nouveau, all the extreme lavishness of the Edwardian Baroque, architects felt that they had to calm down. And for them, back in the 20s, that was modern architecture. That was the modernist that everyone was used about. At the beginning of 20th century, we were talking about that when we talk about architectural education in Spain. In Spain, at the beginning of 20th century, professors would criticize their students for using the modernist and modernism coming from Paris. This modernism coming from Paris wasn't even the Art Nouveau, was the Beaux-Arts style. So, and this also links with something that architect Robert Adams says a lot, that everything is modern because everything is of its time. No matter if we're talking about the Ville Savoie or this gate by Reginald Blomfield, both of them were modern at the time and were perceived as modern. The same way that the latest building by Richard Rogers or by Norman Foster, you name it, and the last building by Quinlan Terry or Stanhope Gate Architecture, they are also modern. And because why? Because they are of their time. And being of our time is nothing else than being done nowadays. So now we're starting to come to the purpose of this lecture, no, which is modernism. Before that, I would like you to show you a debate that was held at the Royal Institute of British Architects on Monday, 21st of May of 1928. Modernism in Architecture. So any modernist sees this and the title sounds promising. Oh, these people Back then, they were already talking about how cool modernism is, how much we love Le Corbusier and Miss van der Rohe and everything. No, there were 18 people taking part of the debate. As you can see, you have people who are more or less of the generation of Reginald Blomfield. Very few. You have Blomfield himself and William Richard Lithaby, who was also a very famous architect. And if you take a look at the numbers, I took the time of putting the numbers. You can see that there were architects who were born in the 60s, architects who were born then in the 80s. And then I think that there is one who was very young, Alfred Horace Gerard, was born in 1899. But all these architects were already in their 30s or 40s by the time the debate was held. They were not kids. They were considered young, but they were not kids. They were already practicing. And this list, we will come to it in the next class because I think it is important to see what these people were actually doing. And I recommend you this debate is available at archive.org. If you look at the RIBA Journal of 1928, you will get it. And if not, you ask me in the group and I will share it with you. It was a very interesting debate. I want you to read it, and if you want, we can come to it next in the next session. Because you could imagine that there was going to be a clash. There was a little bit of a clash, but it was more a clash between those who thought that the older people like Blomfield wanted to come back to neo-Gothic, and then Blomfield and the others explaining that no, we don't want neo-Gothic, and those who wanted what we could call nowadays Art Deco. That was the modernism for them. They mentioned a couple of French architects that do Art Deco. But then it is very interesting because well, they were disagreeing in what modern versus tradition should be. They were all agreeing. I mean, all these architects, before we enter into there, they, you can see in these less prominent Victorians, less eminent Victorians, which is an interesting website where it recalls a lot of Victorian architects, but for the purpose of this, it recalls a lot of the late Victorian architects. A lot of them were even Edwardians because they were too young to have been doing stuff in Victorian era. But it is very interesting to see what they were doing and how they continued up. The youngest one continued up until the 60s doing classical without having to enter into the quirks of the postmodernity. And we will see a lot of them. In the last class, we will see how, without having to go through the postmodern filter, there were a lot of them which continued classical without having to enter into the postmodern thinking. They just were continuing and connecting without having to enter into all the vernacularizing, orders based on materials, and all the justifications that the postmodernists had to do to survive. But hold on your horses. I think that to me, the most striking part of this debate was this. Oops, sorry. Can you still see the screen? Yes. Oh no.
Yes, we can, Pablo.
You can. Okay. Okay. They say that the screen is paused. Okay. It happened again. The most interesting part is, I would say that this by Mr. Harry Stuart Goddard Rendell, when he said, I would make one suggestion. I disagree with some conclusions which were drawn by Sir Reginald Blomfield when he spoke of Le Corbusier as being the essential voice of the modern movement. So we have here Blomfield, who is hated as the most retrograde one, was actually viewing that Le Corbusier was the most prominent voice of the modernist movement. And then see what they were saying. I do not think he is that in any sense. I think he's one of those men who are born old fashioned. I think he has the worst Victorian ethical view of architecture, and he only managed to be heard because he talks a great deal and is very noisy. This is what people were thinking about Le Corbusier in the late 1920s. This is not. This was a young man, 1887. So he was in his he was mid 30s by then. We're not talking about a 70-year-old man, Blomfield, who was portrayed as the grumpy grandpa doing it. We're talking about an architect starting to be in his prime and not accepting Le Corbusier because he was just a noisy guy with worse Victorian values. And these Victorian values is what we were talking about before. It's about all this morality of the Gothic revival and all the because Le Corbusier was a lot like that. And for all these people, what Le Corbusier was symbolizing is more the worst versions of Blomfield, which George Edmund Street being grumpy, Norman Shaw being too old to acknowledge much of of the modern world, and at the same time they were somehow siding with Blomfield. And I think it is very important that you take that. I think that this sentence should appear everywhere on the internet. You could even cut Le Corbusier being the essential point of modern movement. I think it's very important to know what this gentleman said about him, because if you keep reading, everyone agrees. So it's not that there was a isolated person saying that. So it's like he was so disliked that they couldn't even acknowledge that he was a leader of the movement. And by the way, in the whole debate, there is no word to Miss van der Rohe, there is no word to Walter Gropius, there is no word to Frank Lloyd Wright, probably too far in America to do that. And also, specifically Frank Lloyd Wright, because Frank Lloyd Wright was still perceived as a sort of art and craft architect. And Frank Lloyd Wright in the 1920s was the same as these people. He was in his own personal language, but he was not detaching completely. Frank Lloyd Wright never detached from tradition. He just reinvented it and put it on his side. And the only indirect references, remember, it's 1928. They are about the destruction of Europe, the rush that is coming in Europe to the destruction of tradition. And obviously, these are direct uh, connection with the Bauhaus. They don't mention it, but they talk a lot about the Germans destroying the tradition, and they were very concerned about it. It was more concerning to them, as history proved right, the destruction of tradition made by the Bauhaus and Walter Gropius, because Walter Gropius would take that to America later on, that all the runs by back then a young Le Corbusier. So to the eyes of this gentleman, Harry Stuart Goddard Randall, Le Corbusier was more or less his age. It was not a figure of reference. For him, it was just a person who was just wanted to be listened. So this is important for you to consider. And now, as I said, I mean, we're going to talk briefly about the book Modernismus, because what I want to do is that you read it, we read it together, and we discuss it in the next sessions. If there is no interest on it, we will discuss other stuff, because there are always topics to discuss. But I think it will be nice if we all read it at the same time, because it's a book easy to read, and you will find more interest reading this than many other books on the topic that might sound conspiranoic, might sound outside architecture. This is a book about architecture written by an architect, and it's full. I mean, I think that someone should one day do a PhD about it, because each page of the book has 20 pages of comments to understand everything he was saying. It was you are in front of the work of a very literate person. So the contents is divided in 9 chapters. So the chapter 1 is Architecture New and Old, an introduction to the new architecture, where he explains what people at the time considered it was new architecture. It was very interesting because he was quoting people that nowadays are considered as classicists, like, for example, I'm showing it here, Howard Robertson, who wrote a very interesting book called Principles of Architectural Composition. Very interesting one. There is nothing modernist in this book, despite Robertson is considered one of the real precursors of modernism, and he actually did. He actually did a lot for the expansion of modernism in Britain. But at the same time, he knew that everyone needed a base. And so it's very interesting. The second chapter is the architecture of humanism, where he starts talking about what is the classical architecture, what should be classical architecture, and he explains why. This is not about what you think or what I think about humanism, or about what someone else said about humanism, but about what classical architecture has actually been. Then he talks about the last of the old architecture, which is, as he calls, the Baroque. For him, it was Reng. I mean, he's one of the founders of what will be called later on the Renaissance, which is the word in Baroque, which is just like a review of the importance of the architecture of Christopher Wren in the evolution of British architecture, as opposed to the heavyweight of the Georgian architecture, which is without any doubt what everyone thinks about Britain when they think about architecture. Then he dedicates another chapter to the new architecture to discuss what modernism is and what modernism means. Then he dedicates several chapters to more theory of art. The attack on the Greeks, which is basically the attack on tradition. Then the Greeks and modernist sculpture. And then all about painting and sculpture, and then all about music and letters. So the third last chapters have been are usually the ones most quoted because he tends to be very harsh on artists like Picasso and the others, and people have usually mock him because of that, no, as the typical old person who didn't understand. But it's not the case. I think that when you start reading all those chapters, you will realize that he says, I don't know much about new art, but I know a lot about old art. And this is what I'm talking about. So it's very, very interesting. And then the last chapter is the way home. It's like how to fight modernism, because for him, he was very much aware, like unlike his colleagues who thought that modernism was just a fast fashion who would fade, even the younger ones. He thought that it could be dangerous in the sense that it could either A, be a fashion that fades, or being a bomb that implodes and destroys us in the meantime. Unfortunately, he was right. I mean, it was that sort of bomb that destroyed tradition and didn't come back. But it's very interesting to see it. And I think that there is things that, I mean, when he started talking about the new architecture, I mean, I think that I have put this extract when he said that one of the unhappy results of the war has been the loss of standards of value in literature and the arts. It is not merely that these standards are dismissed as out of date. The new generation seems to be unaware that they ever existed, that poetry is not prose, that the sculpture has to deal with form, that painting has something more to do than pattern making. Here he's totally talking about the Bauhaus. An architecture is an art with its own tradition, which cannot be defied with impunity. So again, he's here saying that all this generation that they were not the people who were in this debate. They were the very young student in the early 20s who had lived the younger years, the infantry in the war, and that had been the destruction of the old war through the war. Serious students know that art cannot be really understood without going far back into its history and tracing its course downwards to our time, and it is only in this way that it is possible to grasp the line of its true development. So here he's talking about the need of understanding the past to move toward the future. The modern tendency to ignore this lesson of the past is the opposite extreme to the exaggerated worship of 50 years ago. Both are equally futile. We are not better than our fathers. And this is important. This is quite an important fragment to consider because, again, at the same way that we saw in the debate of 1928, this book is from 1934. All these modernists were perceived as radicals, and not as radicals as new. I mean, now they are perceived as people who brought us everything new and good and fashion and cool stuff. No, they were perceived as zealots. They were perceived as an intransigent, as Blomfield generations of parents, as the grandparents or the great grandparents of these young kids. And the thing is that These people who were born in a difficult moment, which just after the war, we saw a total reconfiguration of the political world, who saw the end of monarchies. Because if you compare the map of Europe before and after the war, it's the increase of republic was enormous. The triumph of communism and the destruction that communism brought in Russia, there was a sense of need, and you were having all the futurists and all the manifesting, which was just basically the destruction of the past. When I think it was Antonio Santelia when he said this thing of the wheel of a Rolls Royce is better than the victory of Samothrace, even considering that the victory of Samothrace is part of the logo of the Rolls Royce. So it's interesting that and how he compares that with the exaggerated worship of 50 years ago, with all this George Edmund Street idea of the moral values of Gothic, all this snobbery of of um, of Ruskin and the art and craft, but also the snobbery from Villele Dick and all the others who wanted to restore in style and be more historical than history itself. So he wanted to depart from that. He was a much more liberal and open-minded people, but he just fought with radicals. And for a radical, open-minded are exactly are reflect on themselves. They are close-minded because they don't understand. They don't want to know. They just want to shout. And I think it's very important to keep that in mind, because we know that in classical architecture there are people who like to complain and to make the big voice, and it's important to have that. But it's also important not to become a zealot, and to be open-minded and to fight with love, if that makes sense. We're going to do at the end. I mean, if you want, we can participate. If not, we can leave it. But I will publish this in the group. In chapter 9, I mean, Blomfield, it says that it was him who arranged the answers. And I think it's interesting. Remember, we're 1934. And he has some questions that like, is engineer making the architect unnecessary today? This was asked in 1934. We're in 2025, and we're still wondering the same question. It's very interesting. That's why I mean that this book is gold. In that sense, has functionalism in building gone too far? We are still questioning that. Can the English town and country ever properly assimilate the new architecture? And if you take out English and you put your country, you still have a very relevant question. This is the perfect. This is the new architecture ugly. Ugly, no, it appears a lot, and then you have a lot of all these people who like saying that AI is in favor of classicism because they say do a beautiful building and they do it traditional. I mean, AI is a trained monkey as today, 2025. One day it might not be, but as today, 2025, it's a trained monkey that will give you what you want to listen. But yeah, in 1934, they were asking the same question as we are now. Is the new architecture ugly? What will the next generation think of the ultra-modern style of present-day buildings, including the ultra-modern house? Well, we are now not the next, but the three generations after, and I think it would be good if we could answer that question to Blomfield, who obviously is dead. Are we likely to evolve in the near future a new style of architectural ornament? This is also interesting because I don't think we have. And Blomfield was questioning that because, again, I mean, as a classicist that he was thinking that the virtue was already there, that completely new was impossible because we had already achieved perfection. We could only do variations. And that shouldn't put us down. And this is one of the most beautiful sentences that the book has. Traditionalism, rightly understood, is a movement forwards, not backwards. And this is very important to consider. Traditional architecture is never backward, it's always forward. And we all design, and we have people who have been designing architecture all their lives. And that is the way that classical architecture works and have been working always since Roman times, since the collapse of the Bronze Age, which is when properly appears. 25 centuries, more than 25 centuries, almost 30 centuries, always moving forward. And that's what they want you to take. And if I have to summarize something on Blomfield's modernism is that. But he wasn't the only one saying that. This is Spain. This is the Royal Academy. And for those of you who are not Spanish, todo lo que no es tradición es plagio. Whatever it is not tradition, is plagiarism. So this is as well a very, very interesting note by Eugenio Dors, one of the philosophers of the early 20th century in Spain. And it's now there, like carved in the Royal Academy to make us think about the importance of tradition and the continuity of tradition. And the tradition is so powerful, so continuous that you cannot get out of it. And what you get out of it is a horror. So better not go out of it. So thank you for this for the lecture today. Before we enter into the debate and I read all the messages, we're going to do the quick miscellanea of things that are going to happen that we talk. We have next week the Progress in Tradition Congress of INBAU in London. Welcome to those of you whom will meet in London at the end of the week. Those of you who will follow online, I think that it's going to be easily available online for anyone attending. So please stay tuned to the INBAU website, and of those of you, I hope to see you there. There is another one, very interesting one, organized by Fundación Culturas Constructivas. There is a first international conference on 20th century classical architecture in Madrid in February next year. So again, stay tuned to Fundación Culturas Constructivas to learn more about this. It's going to be a very, very interesting debate. And of course, for those of you who are interested, we are starting the new course of the Classic Learning Academy on the 13th of November. And we will be very happy to know about you, if you want to come and show your interest. We have a former student with us today, and this is one of his drawings actually, from Miguel. Here he is. Hello, Miguel.
Thank you, Pablo, for the mention.
You are very welcome. We were very happy to have you this year. This is how you will learn. This is how you will see things from the screen, because the course is fully online. So you will be drawing with us at the same pace, drawing the orders, drawing and then designing elements of classical architecture. And this is again a sort of summary of what other students have been presenting on for the exercises. As we said, you can explore the architectural literacy and classic planning. You will learn to draw the Roman orders by hand, read the built environment, and design beautiful big projects that will help you to shape your career as a regional architect, or if you are a settled architect, you can always learn, because life is to learn. And yeah, I mean, now it's time to the question and answers, to the critique, to bring your own project if you want, or we can answer the questions on the questionnaire. Well, you guys decide what to do. I'm going to see the comments. I think that Richard Norman Shaw, thank you very much. Thank you, Sam. Those who are leaving will be able to see the lecture online on YouTube. So any question, gents? Or does any of you want to answer any of these questions?
Hello there, Pablo. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hello there. How are you? Looking forward to seeing you in London next week at the INBAU conference. Not really so much a question. I just thought it was an interesting point you made regarding I think it was the brickwork at the Royal College of Music, whereby you said it was almost produced on a more industrial scale. And maybe it's because I think when we use the words traditional or classical architecture, we think of it as being sort of a pre-industrial age automated process in that regard. Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's the one there, whereby everything will be done individually. And obviously there are great economies of scale to be realized if you can make 1,000 bricks rather than 100 and so on. So I just thought it was an interesting thing to observe there, that just because something is classical in that regard doesn't necessarily mean it isn't automated. It's not quite IKEA, obviously, but it's done perhaps in a different way, that you think you've got individual craftsmen, you're making one brick at a time. Obviously, it's done en masse in that regard.
Correct. I think that in order to build London in 19th century and Paris in Haussmannian time, you needed an industry behind. And obviously bricks, you can say that bricks is the most industrial material because you cannot produce one brick. You have to a whole bunch of them. And since Roman times, they were being produced. And brick and lime are almost semi-industrial products. I mean, remember that in antiquity, they were burning the marble to obtain lime instead of they needed the lime to keep plastering the houses, while the marble was just there as slabs that were not interested anymore. It was a shame, but it was what they did.
Yeah.
So I think that that's something as well to consider. No, this industrialization of classical architecture wasn't something bad per se. The modernists attack it, and also, I mean, but the thing is that the modernists, especially the Bauhaus, was trying to achieve a sort of standardized modern identity. But back then, the first batches were completely disaster because they had to be done by hand. All the products they were selling, all these beautiful, all these sets of pottery and metalware that you see, all that had to be produced by hand because they still had to figure out how to produce them industrially. So it was quite it's very interesting, and that's something that I like because I worked for a lot on time in Cadogan Square and in Ponte Street, and when you walk there, you start seeing all the repetitive items combined in such a way that they don't look repetitive, but that's interesting to take into consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. But no, thank you. Great lecture, as always. Thank you.
So we have Guillaume Clibon. I didn't quite understand what Reginald Blomfield was criticizing Baroque architecture. He wasn't. On the contrary, he was a great admirer of Christopher Wren. And then that's what they were saying. He doesn't criticize Baroque at all. He thought that it was the way, although at the same time, remember that Blomfield had a very long career. The gate that I showed you was at the end of his career, when there was a sense of having that had been an excess a lot of the years, and now it was time to get a little bit simpler. The same way that fashion changes. We have been having some years of slightly minimalistic fashion, and you can see that fashion these days is moving towards a bit more of flamboyance. That we since the 2008 crisis, we went to much more minimalistic, and now we are finally getting rid of all that and forgetting about all that and just having fun. And also very important what Federico has said, that the British Baroque is very particular. Not only for the religious problem, which is, it has two problems. One is a religious problem because they want to keep evolving the language, the classical language, but at the same time, they don't want to look like Italian and French Catholic churches. So actually, when after the Great Fire of London, they have to rebuild St. Paul's, Wren is criticized because of the cupola, because they were saying that he was a papist agent, a secret papist agent, because he was building a cupola looking like St. Peter's. That was first problem. But there is a second problem related with the civil architecture. Because of the tradition of the British monarchy, it's a parliamentarian monarchy. And there is a much bigger bonding than in any other country between the parliament and the crown. In France, the États Generals were by the time that this the restoration of the British monarchy, the États Generals has been convoked in 1613, wouldn't be called again until 1783. In Spain, that had a more, at least still until 17th century, had a more constant calling of the Cortes. Still, there were formalities just for the king to ask for money, and then agree on something. It was not even the pactism that you had on the British Parliament. It was more like the king going to ask money. If you don't give me money, thank you very much, bye. It was just that, and from time to time, the church would accept giving some donations, or things like that. So, but when there is a restoration with Charles II, and then continues with James the second, there is this will of becoming absolutist, of following the steps of France and doing a more absolute monarchy, and with an architecture that would reflect all that. And the British were never very much in favor of that. That's why they had the revolution, I think, in 1685 or 1688, I don't remember which of the two. And then James II is deposed, and then his daughter Mary, together with William the Orange, comes, and they become the kings. It's when they become William and Mary, and then it's Mary's sister Anne who becomes the next queen. And during that time, I mean, because Reign is still alive and he's very relevant and he has shaped the taste of UK, there is like a sort of compromise because they can achieve a more flamboyant architecture, and William is quite astute in that sense, and then he manages to keep the parliament and the nobility happy, and at the same time enjoy all the good things of an absolute monarchy. But that was a bit the complication. What happens? I mean, the things carry on more or less the same with Queen Anne, and then when the Georgians come, when the Hanoverians come, the whole parliament and the nobility sees an opportunity to retake back even more than what they took after William and Mary. Why? Because when George the First comes to UK, he doesn't speak English. He is more worried about Hanover than about Britain. And then they can do a little bit of a better takeover. And that the big translation would be that the Baroque will be rejected, and there will be like an aversion to Baroque, because during the Georgian times there was much more power for the middle nobility, for the nobility, and for the commoners, indirectly, even if it was just nobility infiltrating into the commoners. But that's a bit the idea that you need to bear in mind, Guillem, on the relationship between Britain and Baroque. I hope that you have got it. But please read the chapter, because there is not criticism on that. So, any more comments, or is anyone here who wants to bring a project, something to discuss? Random question not related with the lecture, which you know that we always have.
Pablo, I do have a quick
Yes,
question.
tell me.
So that book of Modernismus by Reginald Blomfield,
Yes,
I've been trying to find it on the internet because I would like to look for a copy. I know in the WhatsApp chats, it's been a topic, but is it still impossible to find one? Just
I,
curious if you
I think
found it.
I found one available for £125. Tried to buy it, and it was not there. So it's almost impossible to find. Keep searching, because it can appear, because I think that the title is so obscure that that it should be easy. Maybe someone selling an old collection of books all of a sudden is selling it because they don't know what they are selling. There is another book by Blomfield, which is slightly older, which from the 1920s, which is called The Touchstone of Architecture, and it's a collection of articles. It's interesting, it's very nice, but it's not the same, because obviously, I mean, it was written 10 years before 1925, and it's more like a collection. You found this in archive.org. Modernism, or the RBA debate. But yeah, so the deduction of architecture is one very interesting, and the other one that you can easily find online. Oh, please share the link, Fernando, please. Is this one, which is the formal garden in England. This is very good. And despite the name England, it's very interesting to understand the development of the gardening. And the English garden has a good advantage. It's not necessarily because when you normally when you learn in a glimpse, in a quick glimpse, the history of architecture, the history of landscaping, you have the French manicured landscape, the English wild landscape, but there is an in between English landscape that works very well even nowadays. It's very easy to maintain, it's very pretty, works very well with small spaces, and Blomfield talks about that. I don't know why, Fernando. I mean, it says it tells that the site cannot be reached when I try to download it. But that will be great. I mean, I in the group we have the copy, but I mean it's a scan that I did at the VNA. No, it's because the thing is that the annasarchive.org, I cannot even access that website. That's the strange thing. Scroll down, but I cannot even scroll down. I mean, I just get this site cannot be reached. That's what I don't understand. Does any of you get the same?
Pablo, I'm able to access it. I didn't know how to download it, but Fernando, you're saying that I have to choose slow download. So I can download it and then send it to you if you like.
Oh, yes, please, because probably it will be a much better scan than the one I did. That will be
Okay.
great.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Thank you. I mean, I don't know why I cannot access it. Probably it's a thing that is available in America, but not in Europe or something like that. But excellent, and thank you for sharing that, Fernando. That will be great to have a better copy. Maybe it's even edited so that you can use the copy and paste the text. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's been a good and hopefully not very long session today. I mean, it was being an hour, almost 2 hours, but you know that we have had like 3 or 4 hours before. So I think we are doing a better timing. And then, yeah, if you don't have any more comments, I hope to see all of you in London or online on our next session on the 1st of November, where we will be talking about all the people who, in that 1928 debate, they were on their 30s and how they lived with the modernists in a moment in which modernism was perceived as an option, was perceived as a quirky fashion. And that's interesting to know and to understand how these people lived, and also at the same time how they were caught by surprise when after the Second World War, modernists start becoming more verbal, more aggressive, and that's how they took over, because all these people, they always thought that there was just another option. They never saw them as a threat, while the modernists saw it. But until then, thank you very much. You can reach me or by email or in our WhatsApp group. If you don't have access to the WhatsApp group, just ping me an email, ping me a message, and we will include you. And until then, thank you very much and goodbye. And for those who have left, you will be able to see in a couple of hours or 3, I will upload the video. So thank you very much. I hope that you have enjoyed, and see you soon.
Thank you, Pablo.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.